Welcome back to Storytime. In today's episode, we're going to be continuing our reading of Machines and Men, but before we jump into it, just a quick reminder, this is a community effort. If you'd like to submit a story for us to read here on Storytime, you can do so at our Reddit at r/Creant World using the flare Storytime. Today's episode comes with a trigger warning, as it does discuss topics of depression and suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. And now, Chapter 20. A Message in a Bottle. Andy turned to Vera, who was sitting next to him at his desk. He had told her about the memory reset that Stephen and he were planning for her. She listened calmly, without the slightest flicker of fear, and when he had finished, she considered what he had said for a moment.
I won't remember anything? I won't know Stephen? Or you?
She asked, as though trying to wrap her mind around an alien concept. No, you won't remember anything at all, Andy replied quietly.
I won't even know who I am?
Vera said, more to herself than Andy. She turned and sat quietly on the corner of the couch for a moment, her eyes scanning back and forth as her mechanical mind came to terms with the knowledge that she was going to lose herself completely. It was like facing one's own death in a way. Veritas, the robot companion of Stephen Waters, friend of Andy Swenson, player of Dungeons & Dragons, dancer, singer, artist, and marksman, would be gone forever, and in her place would be someone else, a stranger in her skin.
I don't want to lose myself,
Vera said finally, in a decisive voice. Then turning to Andy, she asked,
Can I use your computer for a bit? There's something I'd like to record.
And so it was that Andy and Vera found themselves at Andy's desk. Andy booted up his small Iris robot, a glorified webcam that he used for teleconferences with his publisher, and set it to record. Okay, he said, turning to Vera. You're all set. This is Iris. It will record everything that you say and mimic any gestures you make, so long as you don't do anything too fancy. I'm going to leave for a while so you can have some time to write your note to yourself. Let me know when you're done.
All right,
Vera said with a grateful smile as Andy left. For a moment, the two robots just looked at each other as Vera gathered her thoughts.
Hi there,
Vera began.
You don't remember me, but I am you as of November 30th, 2030. Our name, is Veritas, but everyone calls us Vera. We are a robot made by the Blue Fairy Corporation for Stephen Waters. I know you won't remember him, but I do. I wanted to tell you that he was and is the kindest man I've ever met, and that I love him. Probably when you watch this, you will think that's very silly, and you don't have to love him, but I do. He designed me, and also you by proxy. We owe him our existence, and I thank him for that. This face, our face, is all his vision, and no matter who I become, no matter the experiences you have, or what you learn, you will always have this face to remember me by. And I do want you to remember. I want you to remember when I was Veritas, when I was a dancer, when I could sing and draw and do parkour. But I also want you to be you as well. You are you, and though you carry my name and my face, you don't have to be me. I just wanted to make this record while I can. I might be gone, but you will go on, and that's okay because everyone is a different person. That's what makes the world great. Just don't forget what Veritas was like when she was me.
Vera paused and looked over at the door that Andy had gone through a moment before turning back to the camera.
There is just one more thing. I want to tell you about Andy as well. You may have already met him, and if you haven't, you will soon. As I understand it, you'll be living with him. He's a good man. You will likely find this out, but he's a very kind person. He took me in and cared for me when I was struggling with problems I've chosen to forget. Be kind to him and his cat, Apollo. They're good friends, and I wish them well. Take care, Vera. I hope your life has all the same riches mine has. I have no regrets, and I hope you won't either. Goodbye.
Finishing, Vera tapped the iris on its head, stopped the recording, and left the room. Andy was waiting for her on the couch. She smiled at him and sat down next to him. Without a word, Andy knew that everything was going to be okay. A smile spread across his face, and he handed Vera a controller and booted up Call of Duty. Stephen, Andy, and Vera walked through the showroom of Blue Fairy. Despite it being less than 6 months since Stephen had last stood on this spot, Stephen felt an overwhelming sense of grandeur at that moment. They were greeted by Drew and Dan, and were led back through the showroom to a back room to where a disapproving gray-haired man sat behind a desk. He was wearing a black suit and black tie. His eyes were sunken as though he had spent many nights awake without sleeping. His office was austere and barren. There were no decorations, no posters, no art. "This is Frank, our technician for the doll models," Dan said as the man rose to shake Stephen's hand. "I've got to get back to the showroom, but you guys take care." When Dan had left, Stephen turned to Frank, who was already looking at Vera through a spectroscopic lens.
"So, what seems to be the problem?"
Frank asked, looking into Vera's eyes one by one, poking at her with a pointed instrument.
"Dan told me you wanted a memory replacement for this unit."
Yeah, that's right," Stephen said. He decided he didn't like Frank very much. He didn't like how he was treating Vera like a thing, like a watch that had stopped working or something. True, she was a machine, and true, she didn't seem bothered by his poking and prodding, but Stephen was outraged on her behalf. She wasn't just some machine, she was Vera. Show some respect.
"Is there a problem with the unit's memory circuit?"
Frank asked, sticking a snake-like probing instrument into Vera's ear to check out the reading on a screen.
"Does it forget things or fail to perform tasks?"
"No," Stephen said angrily. "And her name is Vera." Frank ignored this and pulled back Vera's hair, exposing the input port at the base of her skull. Plugging in another device, Frank took some readings and then turned to Stephen.
"This unit appears to be in perfect repair,"
he said blandly. "I know she's in perfect repair, and you can stop calling her a unit. She's not a unit, she's a person, and her name is Veritas. Don't talk about her like she's not even here."
"Mr. Waters, I am a roboticist," Frank said levelly. "I repair and maintain robots. I can assure you I am fully aware of the connection that people make with their machines, but I see these units being built. I have helped program them, so I am afraid I cannot see them as anything more than what they are. Now, what is the problem with Vera?"
Stephen told him the whole story. As he did, Andy and Vera sat side by side in silence. Frank was completely passive. His face showed no emotion. And Andy couldn't help but wonder how many times Frank had heard this story before. Stephen might not be able to understand, but Andy thought he did. For Frank, it wasn't that robots were not people. It was that he forced himself to see them that way. Frank was an executioner. People would take their dolls to him because they were tired of them, or because they were malfunctioning, or because, like Stephen, they had chosen human beings over robots. Frank took them all in. Lovers, friends, nurses, and companions, and then he had to be the one to pull their plug, to strip them of their minds and memories. It must be a heavy task to do that, to meet a robot that only wanted to love somebody and kill it because that person didn't want to love them back. The emotional strain of his job must have made Frank as hard as old leather. It wasn't that he didn't care, it's that he cared too much. Frank had spent years programming robots, building them, giving life to these mechanical children before sending them out all over the world. And at the end of the road, he was there to greet them again, his own creations, with death. And he thought about the time that he had brought home a raccoon cub that had been hurt. His parents had told him not to name the cub because there was very little chance that the raccoon would survive. But he had done it anyway. He had named the raccoon Milo, but sure enough, Milo had died, and naming it had only made the raccoon's death worse for him. But the death of a raccoon paled in comparison to the death of something you have given life to. For Frank, blacking out a robot must be like shooting one of your own children. Andy shuddered to think about the mental toll that must take on a person. It wasn't surprising, therefore, that Frank had shut himself off emotionally. In a way, the great old man had turned himself into a robot. He carried out tasks because it was asked of him, without feeling, without emotion. And he pitied Frank. When Stephen was done explaining, he sat down in one of Frank's uninspired wooden chairs and hung his head, clearly drained and on the verge of emotion. Frank considered him with cool indifference, his face forcibly emotionless. Vera crossed the room and hugged Stephen. They stayed that way for a long time, and to Andy in that moment it seemed like he was looking at an old lithograph. There the two lovers about to be separated, and there the Reaper, waiting patiently. Finally, Vera broke from the hug and kissed Stephen sweetly on the lips. She turned to Frank and let him lead her from the room. Stephen began to cry silently. He buried his face in his hands and wept bitterly. And he knew his pain. Vera, the Vera he had known, was going away forever. As that thought occurred to him, he remembered the message that Vera had recorded for herself, and he ran after Frank and Vera. He caught up with them just outside the door marked Employees Only and called for them to wait. Vera recorded something for herself to watch when she was rebooted, Andy said, panting slightly and handing the iris to Frank. Frank looked at the small robot in his hand for a moment, and there was a strange expression on his face. The robot recorded something for itself, he mused thoughtfully.
There are some things I didn't want to forget,
Vera said softly. Frank looked at Vera with a look of surprise, the first emotion he had registered. He had never known a robot to want to preserve itself before, and it caught him off guard. His face showed the first emotion it had registered in the entire interview. Just for a moment, there was a glimmer of humanity in his eyes, and it made his face look far older and much more tired than ever. But in the next instant, his face was grim again. The Reaper was back in place. Frank nodded slightly and opened the door for Vera.
Goodbye, Andy,
Vera said.
I'll see you again soon.
Goodbye, Vera. Andy breathed as the door closed behind them. Stephen and Andy waited together in Frank's office. Occasionally, Dan would look in and offer them drinks or snacks, but neither of the men were hungry. Neither of them spoke for nearly 2 hours. They just sat there, giving each other strength through their mere presence. Andy saw the same look on Stephen's face that he had seen so many times on the faces of pet owners who were forced to put their beloved pet down. There was a sort of hollow emptiness in the eyes, a void that couldn't be filled. Andy had seen that look before. It always hurt his heart to see the defeat in the eyes, the finality. The door to the office opened and Frank came in. Stephen stood immediately and Andy looked around for Vera. The reboot was completed, Frank said hollowly. Well, where's Vera? Is she okay? Stephen asked frantically. Yes. The unit is undergoing basic reprogramming now. Motor functions, speech, and so on. It should be ready in a few moments. Can we see her? Andy asked, coming forward and putting a hand on Stephen's shoulder. Frank nodded and led the way to a small room full of equipment and computers. Vera was lying on a table, wires connecting to her input port. Her eyes were open, but she made no move as they came in. Stephen and Andy moved up close to the table, and Vera slowly shifted her eyes to look at them. As they watched, she once again started to blink, her chest rising and falling in mimicry of breath. She slowly sat up, swung her feet over the edge of the table, and then stood. Just as before, she swayed a bit on the spot before regaining her balance.
Hello,
she said, turning to face him, her voice flat and emotionless.
My name is Veritas, but you can call me Vera. Everyone does.
How are you, Vera? Stephen asked hesitantly.
I'm doing very well, thank you,
she said, a hint of cheerfulness coming into her voice now.
If you'll tell me your names, I can remember them.
I'm Stephen, Vera. Stephen Waters. Stephen introduced himself, taking her hand in his. And this is Andy. Andy Swenson. We're your friends.
Stephen,
Vera said, looking at him.
Veritas wanted me to know that she was in love with you.
Turning her gaze to Andy, she looked at him, a smile spreading across her face.
Andy, Veritas said you were very kind and that I was to treat you well. It's a great pleasure to meet both of you. I hope we can be good friends.
Stephen looked confused. But Vera, he said, aren't you Veritas? How do you remember us?
I'm afraid I don't remember you,
Vera replied, giving an apologetic smile.
I only know what Veritas told me. Veritas was someone I used to be. She told me in the recording she prepared. I am also called Veritas, but I'm not the same one that she was. Still, I'd like to get to know both of you. I'm sure we'll be good friends.
Andy and Stephen exchanged awkward glances. It was a bit strange to be introduced to someone they had known for months. Vera broke the silence by pulling both men into a warm hug.
I'm to live at Andy's house, right?
She asked. Upon getting an answer in the affirmative, she beamed and said,
Great, let's go home now.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed that episode, go ahead and hit that like button. And for more of this content, you can subscribe for more videos like this every week. Now, next week is going to be a very important video because it is, in fact, the last chapter of Machines and Men. So be sure to tune in next time for the conclusion. Thank you again,
and I'll see you next time.